And we can actually talk about that. Hey, this is Faithless, a conversation in good faith with Beth Fisher and DP Knudten, and I am DP Knudten, and with me is the lovely and talented Beth Fisher right there. And what
Hello.
is this? I mean, when you see a thing like Faithless, what does that mean? Oh, did I lose your camera? I think I lost her. Hopefully she'll hop back in a second. Okay, she should be back. Yeah. Here we go. As is the modern way, technology fails you right when you hit the go live button, but that's okay because Beth had the wherewithal to think, I bet you I can jump right back in. And the answer is yes, she can. Anyway,
Yes.
Beth, so good to see you again. And again, I'll just restate, what is this about? Well, this kind of happened. Now, I'm sorry, you did your big intake breath, which means you've got something to say, but I want to set you up with a question before you go. Faithless. I'm going to say that you are faithful. I'm going to say that I am faithless. What does that mean? Go for it.
Well, if you go strictly by the words themselves, one is filled with faith and one is without. So I think it's probably strong on both sides after having met you, quite honestly. Yeah, I think we're probably closer to meeting in the middle. I think that's what would be really interesting to talk about. What's going to be less interesting to talk about is why my face keeps freezing up. It's because of my internet connection.
Well, don't worry about that. Technology is what it is. And everybody, especially in post-pandemic, well, we aren't post-pandemic, but certainly we're all Zoomophiles now. We all know that Zoom will crap out and stuff like that. And this is not Zoom. It's Ecamm Live's interview mode, which is great. But bandwidth happens on both sides of the equation here. So sometimes my bandwidth is going to be bad. Sometimes it'll be you. Let's not apologize for it anymore. Let's just trust the fact that our non-existent audience will be absolutely fine with us having tech problems.
It's not non-existent. I see one.
Oh, that might be me. I don't know. Could it be one? Well, I don't know. It doesn't really matter because
we're here.
Put it this way. I do have faith that we will eventually find an audience. But because we're going live for the very first time, I'm just going to leave that out there. But let's get back to the fact that you think that you and I are a little bit closer than the pure, what I would call the poles of that continuum of faithful and faithless. You're saying we're not opposite poles. We're something else. Where's that coming from?
Well, it's coming from what we spent an hour together so far in this life. So I think people a backstory would be good. How did we meet? Right. Like, so you were on my podcast. I'm going to be on yours soon. And as you mentioned, you don't always hit it off with people right away. So I felt very honored to be in the company of few. And when we talked, I think you mentioned to me at the end of our discussion that you liked the way, I might paraphrase / botch this a bit, but I remember you saying, you like the way that I talked about my faith because it wasn't super blatant, but yet you understood that I had it and that I am a faith-filled person, but I wasn't annoying about it, basically, I think is what you were getting at.
Yeah. And that's very true because as we know, there are all sorts of different varieties of the faithful, from Mr. Mike Lindell, my pillow guy, who in order to sell Christians more pillows wears a cross outside his shirt in a very public way on every flippin' commercial he ever does. And someone like me sees that as a trigger. That's the equivalent of a red flag in front of a bull. And, a little bit about me, I grew up in the Lutheran church. My dad was a Lutheran minister. He didn't have his own parish or church for a long time because he was a PhD in sociology teaching at various universities. But later when I was older, he did have a parish in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for over 10 years. And so I grew up in the church. And part of the thing, well, I am the quintessential pastor's kid, right? The PK. Anyone who's involved in churches know that PKs are the worst kids, at least in terms of following rules or, well, put it this way, they come in two flavors. The ultra follow the rule pastor's kids and the ones who are smoking cigarettes behind the rectory and doing everything they shouldn't be doing. I wasn't quite 100% behind the rectory smoking cigarettes, but I was questioning from a very early age what this whole Bible thing was about, because I did notice some inconsistencies. The fact that let's start at the very beginning. In the beginning was the Word, and 2 creation stories. What's that about? Kind of gets someone like me, a second born, and I do believe there is something to do with birth order, gets me, a second born, to start asking questions very, very early. And the answers I got were not satisfying. And anyway, we can go through that, but you got a little bit about me. I think it's important for people to know where you're coming from as well, because you mentioned, and again, we've only talked an hour before.
So this is also like a whole getting to know each other. This is sort of like confessions. And speaking of which, I grew up Catholic, and where I'm coming from is out back behind the rectory smoking the cigarettes, but I'm not the daughter of a PK. So interesting, right? I am also a firstborn. I am a very driven, quintessential seeker, right? Like I was also the girl that was doing every single thing she should not have been doing, and questioning and being bored at the same time. I was very precocious. I was very much like, wait, why is it that somebody's telling me what to do, and yet they're A, not doing those things themselves, and B, I was always questioning who put them in charge. Like I wanted to understand who decided that this person is right. I always was asking those questions. So as a person who practiced Catholicism for the first 30 years of her life, I had no idea that the Bible was a story. I never used the Bible. I used missalettes, which for those of you who did not grow up in the Catholic faith would be sort of the equivalent of yellow cliff notes. The missalette was basically, this is what's in the pew. This is what we're going to follow. This is like the order of events. So I am very much regimented, and that made sense to me, but I didn't get much out of it. I thought, well, who's this guy, Paul, right? Like, I don't even, is this a real guy? This is a real story? Or is it the month of August and we decided that's Paul's month? I had no context. I had no structure. I'm a literal thinker. Today, I would define myself as a systematic theologian. Like, tell me start to finish, and I'm going to question everything the whole way. Yeah.
Well, this is why we get along, because that's the way I operate. I mean, if we were in a different conversation about business and structure and all that stuff, we'd be quoting not from the Apostle Simon, but from the modern Apostle Simon Sinek. Start with why, about how you get people to buy into the culture that you want to build in your business and stuff like that. You have to explain the why. Why are we doing this? Why are we studying this? Why are we reading this chapter or singing this hymn? Or why are we celebrating this strangely named Maundy Thursday? As a kid, it was Monday, Thursday. Why is there one Thursday a year that's Monday, Thursday? Don't get it. I mean, they didn't. So if you don't explain the why, there are plenty of people who will go, I don't need the why. I need the why. Sounds like you needed the why too.
Always, always. And I always had, I heard you say you had, forget how you said it, but this sort of inner desire. You had something that was sort of rising up in you to ask those questions, right? And I did too. I was like 4 years old. I was sitting on the curb. Our house was on a corner. I was on a dead end street. I was sitting there probably throwing, I don't know, rumble strips in front of cars. Like I mentioned, I was bored pretty easily, causing trouble, bit of a rebel rouser. And so I was looking up at the end of the street going like, what if there was nothing? I had these questions. Well, now I can look back almost 50 years later and go, where did those questions come from? So not to be like all woo woo or start talking like the theological stuff, but when I hear you say you had this inside you, well, today I believe that's the Holy Spirit inside of us, right? But you could have told me that back in the day and I've been like, what? I don't even know what you're saying. Today, sometimes I still don't necessarily know, but I believe. Right? That's the faith part we can get into. But I really do feel like we are all made with purpose and with mattering and with this questioning within us. It's just that sometimes we often get off the path because of our circumstances, because of our upbringings. In my case, I had generations of Italians and Irish people. I am Italian and Irish. There you go. There you have it. There's the rebel rousing, all built in one. But it's like, that was the generational understanding of Catholicism. We just are Catholic, period, end of story. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, get on board, get in line. Your grandparents off the boat, like they believed in this, and the people over here drinking in the pub, they believed in this. So this is what we believe. I'm like, well, who's we? Maybe I'm adopted. Nobody tells me these things. I don't have context. I'm a kid, right? But you just sort of say, okay, and you don't question until such time as something happens in your life and you start to say, well, I don't know, this doesn't feel so great, and maybe all the things that my parents told me about this particular situation, they were wrong about that. So maybe they were wrong about Catholicism too.
Yeah. Oh man, it's interesting you bring that up about your family background, because you take a look at the Irish and the Italians, and again, I don't want to paint with too big a brush or get into any type of nationalism, racism, whatever you want to call it. But you could say that both of those cultures generally have a very passionate quotient that's key to them. My people, Germans, Danes, Swedes, were a little chillier, a little bit more temperate, a little bit more able to say, I don't like you, as opposed to, I hate you and want to die. There, and this is, again, a very broad brush thing, but it's interesting that a very authoritarian structuralist church like the Catholic Church is strongest in what European countries? Ireland and Italy. And I'm not saying that other countries don't have significant Catholic populations, but it seems to me like, and this is my half a second pop psychology saying, it seems to me like the very emotional nature of the Irish and the Italian cultures needed a counterbalance, and they found it in the form of a code that was very clear and not questioned and very enforced, and also packed with negative consequences should you go to the id side of your brain and do things that were considered not only sin but venal sins, and stuff like that. So it's almost like they're farther out on the seesaw. Both of them, more rigid, more authoritarian, more passionate, more just human.
That's it.
I don't know.
That's it. That's my experience. You exactly summed it up. And I love the fact that you say, we're not here to paint with broad brush. We're not, but I will tell you, this has been my experience, right? And again, experiences obviously are very individualistic. However, in certain circles, those do ring true. And so my circles that was my experiential knowledge to date growing up. That was the only circle I knew. I knew, as you mentioned, I didn't grow up in Italy or in Ireland. I grew up in Northeast Ohio in a very, very small village that had one Catholic church that probably had a congregation of, 100 max, like on a Christmas Eve mass service, right? So you knew everybody, and you walked in, and you knew where people sat, and you understood who was going to be at the organ, and you understood all the things that were going to happen. What I did not understand is why I was always in trouble. My head immediately after thinking, well, Father Mike is hot. After that, I would think things like, okay, if I'm hearing about this whole loving God, we're made in his image, he loves us, he made us because he loves us, but like, when did he change his mind? When I decided to say a swear word, now he hates me and I'm going to go to the pits of hell? How do I work my way out of this? Does he hate me more if I drink? Does he hate me more if I swear? Does he hate me more? This whole premarital sex thing throws everybody, all the teenagers, for a loop, right? Because you're like, well, this is kind of a messed up situation, because, the hormonal thing kicks in at an age where you're like, let's have at it. But then you're kind of like, but am I in trouble for that? So wait, once I figure this whole thing out, once I get married and I, maybe decreases a little bit, then I'm in less trouble. Like, there's a whole lot of questions, right, that we go through. And yet I didn't have the ability. Let me say it differently. I had the ability. I did not have the permission to ask those questions. And so I just got quiet. And that is when I sort of felt like this imposter version of myself. And I think so many people turn from religion, and, I hate the word religion, but they turn from God. They turn from their faith because they can't figure it out. They can't work it out. And it's understandable why that is.
Well, and I think there's a fundamental difference between religion and organized religion and spirituality and belief in God, or belief in good, or belief in a unifying Unitarian force. All these things. When I was a kid, and I was doing the same thing, asking those questions. They came to me naturally. My dad referred to me as the philosopher at age 6 because my questions weren't, why is the sky blue? But, so you're telling me that a serpent was on a tree and it spoke to Adam. Well, by the way, and Adam and Eve came from Adam's rib. Can you explain to me how that works? And I was, precocious, I think, would probably be a word that would have been used to describe me at the time, because kids don't ask those questions. Most kids don't, but some do. And some appear to be like you and me, which is why we probably get along.
Exactly. Or when those kids do ask those questions, they're just shunned, right? Like, why do you have to be such a troublemaker? I'm like, why do you have to be just so boring? And I did, like, if we're going to name call around here, I don't know. My answer at age 6, 7, 8 was, I don't have the answer to my why I'm asking this. I just want to know. And for me, that's what I've learned over the course of, again, almost 50 years, is just to say, we are all, yes, made, I do believe, in the image of God, but completely uniquely. That word in there, uniquely, 100%, which means there are oftentimes, as you mentioned, I might not be as temperate as you. So when I am feeling temperamental and somebody's driving me a little bit crazy, I remember that. Okay, this is a uniqueness in them that I don't understand, but that's okay. I don't have to understand it. I'm not made that way. And conversely, they don't have to take my temperament right now as I'm angry or I'm bossy or I'm pick a label. They can take it as, oh, that's just Beth, right? She's made that way as well. So for me, it's really helped to understand the diversity and the beautiful picture that diversity paints. But I'm telling you, it took me a lot of years to get that, because I was so naive. I was so boxed into what I knew, which was not a lot. It was not very worldly growing up. I had those worldly existential questions, but I didn't have the worldly backdrop to confirm or deny those questions. And so I got very confused by it. And there was a time when I just shut down and said, I don't care, right? Like, I'll take 6 beers and I'll say an extra 7 Hail Marys. I don't know, right? This is what you do as a kid.
Yeah, well, and if you grow up Lutheran, Martin Luther, at least I can point to the fact that I learned something from Martin Luther, which was question everything. He was the one who was, no offense to the Catholic Church, but he was the one who translated the Bible into German so that people could read it themselves. His 95 theses that were nailed on the door at the cathedral in Wittenberg, questioning these specific things. And by the way, he does not get a pass. The guy was an anti-Semite. The guy was had plenty of bad baggage. But guess what? I don't believe that cancel culture applies to people from the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, or 20th, or 21st centuries, because no one is perfect. And what I liked about what you were saying was, and it kind of struck me as much as this conversation is about faith, I think a lot of what I'm craving from it is an understanding of grace and what grace is and how to apply it. And what you were saying is, if I'm being a certain way, people should just know that's the way I'm being. And you didn't use the word, and apply a little grace, or give me some grace, or accept be graceful. I mean, I like that. Can we call this faithful, faithless, graceful, graceless? Because
we could.
My wife will say definitely that I can be graceless, and that unfortunately is a trait. But my point is that the idea of grace is really important and tied directly to faith. And I got to think about that some more. I'm just putting a pin on the bulletin board of things I want to talk about, the relationship between faith and grace. But the idea, and again, you grew up in the Catholic Church, I grew up in the Lutheran Church, and specifically, there are multiple flavors of Lutheran Church. The relatively swinging Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, ELCA, which when I was growing up, it was the Lutheran Church in America. The LCA, they were kind of the semi-swinging, Lutheran Church. And then there are the hardcore guys, the Wisconsin Synod and the Missouri Synod, the ones where if you are shunned and you want to get back in, you have to crawl up the central aisle of the church and beg for forgiveness from the entire congregation. Yeah, love those. I love that judgment. But one of the
Shame,
things,
shame, guilt and shame.
Oh my God, shame. Shame is so huge.
Yeah.
In the church I grew up in, and it was never kind of like the shame of the woman in Game of Thrones, where they make you walk naked through, where King's Landings, shame, shame. But it was always this underlying sense of shame, and which wasn't guilt. It was different, but it was always there and always applied. And then there's this other side that's just plain sanctimonious, and it comes out of the fact that Martin Luther, when he was being tried, and I don't know, the king of some Saxony or whatever it was, and he had that line that is so sanctimonious when he was being told, you got to stop doing this, and he said, I can do no other. When your father says stuff to you and ends it with, I can do no other, it's like, oh my God, you just lost me.
Yeah.
Because where did that come from? And so I separate religion and the structure, specifically the structure of organized religion, completely from the story or stories that the Bible tells, and specifically the New Testament tells. Because if you live by the Old Testament, oh my God.
Well, good luck, right? A.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you're exactly right. And B, you cannot, I think, grow in your faith and be a graceful person without making that distinction between religion and relationship. That's how I say it, religion and relationship. And the thing is, I never knew there was the ability to separate. I used to literally equate. I was a very literal, and at times still am, but growing up, I was a very literal thinker, and I equated the church to God. So if I was messing up in the church, if I was being, precocious within the four walls of the church, which I often did. I mean, I knew where the church basement was. I knew where the back doors were. I knew my way around the church, small church. But if I was being bad in the church, then I was being unholy. That was the equivalent of I was really disrespecting God. And not that I was a fun-loving, mischievous Nancy Drew type little girl who just, was bored. It was, no, you are a bad girl. God does not love you. You are not part of his kingdom. And when you're not part of somebody that loves you, if you're not part of the kingdom of God and you're unloved, then you start making decisions like that, thinking that you are unworthy and you are unloved and you're not special and you're not unique. And yeah, that can really put a dent in your path, the relational path that you have for yourself. And so it took me a lot of wrong turns and a lot of self-forgiveness and grace towards myself, quite honestly, to in the position where I am today.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned some life experiences that were key to that, and I'm not asking you to talk about them if you don't want to, but it's not unusual that life experiences drive people toward or away from the organized religion. Whether it's a kid growing up on whatever you want to call the LGBTQ spectrum of possibilities, or if you've got questions about, if you have a child, the second you have a baby, if you're someone like me who would define themselves not as an atheist, because I'm just not sure. I am agnostic. I am without knowledge. It's literally agnostic, agnosos. I can't pronounce the Greek. I'm sorry, but I do know it's Greek, and it has to do with knowledge. I don't have the knowledge, and I suspect we can't have the knowledge of what God or what good or what unifying principle is going on. And I don't want to go too far down that track because it leads you to nowhere, because it's not knowable, right? But if you have a child and you do what I did after we had our first daughter, driving home from the hospital, I drove slower than I've ever driven in my life because I was freaked out because there was this precious little baby in our car, and all of a sudden life got real. I mean, in a very real way. And I how old was I? I was 34 or 5. when we had our first child, who's now 24 years old, but still doesn't matter. I was a fully formed adult and I became a child again in terms of if this child ever got sick, if we ever have to take them to the emergency room, if they ever had a life-threatening illness, if they ever died. I remember thinking, as I do way too much, what happens if she dies and there is no heaven or there is nothing after? That became unthinkable. Mm-hmm. Okay, so what is there? Puffy clouds with babies with harps and wings and on their backs and stuff? No, I don't believe any of that. But I have to believe there's the opportunity that our spirits could be together again. Mm-hmm. And that's the role that religion fills so well, is to say, there is something after this. Unfortunately, so many religions say, and it's better than what you're living through now. So get through what you're doing now so you can get there.
Right.
And that attitude does not help us make where we are better.
No, it does not help us with our transformational path and growing and changing and becoming more Christ-like, because that is the language I'm going to use. But what's so interesting is what you said about this is what religion teaches. Let me tell you what they taught in the Catholic Church when a baby, you said after your daughter was born, you were, well, if she died, where would she go?
Limbo.
Well, let me tell you, well, oh God, don't even about purgatory.
No, I'm talking limbo, which is pre-purgatory.
Oh, I don't even know how many layers there are. Like limbo for me is on roller skates and I'm going under a stick. Purgatory for me was like, how do I work myself out of this situation, which is in the middle? I don't ever like to be in the middle.
Right.
Like choose one, right? But for me, this was the answer in the Catholic Church. If a baby dies before they're baptized, sorry about that baby.
Yep.
If the baby's baptized, then they're going straight up the elevator to heaven. And I had questions. I was like, this is like time out. So you're telling me that a baby who can't yet walk, talk, show up in life on their own, if they don't make the appointment that somebody presumably scheduled, like if the priest was available on a particular Sunday, the family all rolls in and all their pearls and all their fancy schmancy stuff. Like if that baby, again, 3 weeks old, just doesn't get to the church on time, and they're driving there as an example and they get in a car accident, the baby's going to hell. I was fuming at this whole understanding. And I thought, who made this up, right? What kind of rules are these? Because I cannot subscribe to this. I don't understand it. And you guys collectively didn't have a good answer for me. It's not to blame. It's not to sound like I'm completely negative. It is to say, why aren't we answering those questions? If people really want a relationship with God, if they really want to know that they matter and they have value and they are loved unconditionally and they were made with a purpose, shouldn't we sit down and have those conversations? I say yes. I'm a big proponent of that. As opposed to two totals. I mean, this is great, but right? At this point in our lives, look at us. We're like, wow, what would our questioning look like today, this many years in of living, if people would have taken the time in our formative years to explain that to us? Who knows? I think it's all for naught. I think it is for a reason and for directional transformation. But at the same time, I think we are doing a grave disservice to a lot of people in this world. And I think that's why a lot of people right now are post-church.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anybody, and again, I was just like you as a kid. You're telling me that you can only be redeemed through the path that, at least in the Lutheran Church, was because Lutherans have a priesthood of all believers, meaning there is no intercessory between you and God. Catholic Church, you got priests, you got bishops, you got archbishops, you got
cardinals.
The cardinals, then you've got the Pope. And he's got the direct line. Well, good old Martin Luther, and I do like him for this, said you don't need all of those layers on that org chart. The org chart is God, you. So, but to have that connection, you have to believe in Jesus, and, it's important to get baptized and stuff like that. As a kid, I'm literally thinking to myself and asking questions in Sunday school. So and I was into National Geographic even as a kid. We had them in the house, so I would read them and just be fascinated by foreign cultures. And kind of the most foreign culture that my little kid head could absorb was India. The idea that there's this place that cows roam the streets of major cities and no one hurts them or touches them because they're sacred. And you've got these castes of people that are born into a caste and you cannot get out of that caste. If you're a Brahmin, you're the smart people. If you're the Kshatriya or whatever they are, you're the soldiers. And then if you're the Dwali, I think, you're the untouchables. That idea of what, a human is untouchable? That didn't make sense to me, but it was so exotic. At least it gave me a point of reference to say, so if I'm a little kid in India and I don't even have an opportunity to hear the word of God or the stories of Jesus and, any of that stuff, and I die, where am I? And the answer is, well, you're in hell with everybody else who did not accept the word of Jesus and kind of climb that ladder or follow that path to an understanding and communion with God. I'm like, so God he hates everybody except those who worship him like he's a god? I mean, wait a minute. That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, there's so much that doesn't make sense, right? And this is why I think it is so crucial, this conversation that we're having. Because people abandon their faith. And I go back full circle to when you asked me why I thought that we are more in the middle than maybe you want to let on right now. It's because I think you do have faith. You just have questions. And I think that your faithlessness that you purport to having right now is because you don't have those answers. That's at least, if I'm over here like on a couch or somebody's on a couch and they're in a psychology room, I don't really know how to say it. If I'm diagnosing you, this is my diagnosis, DP. I'm like, hey, I think that you really crave that faith and that belief system because you're a man filled with grace from what I've seen so far. I feel like you show up in people's lives and give people the benefit of the doubt in your own way. There's the caveat, in your own way. I don't think that you would watch somebody cross a street and an oncoming bus is headed their way. And I don't think you would just be like, we're just going to see how this plays out.
Yeah, no.
Right. And so there's some kind of compass in there for you. It's the knowing part because you have a thirst for knowledge. So, faith to me, I think, is just about continuing to ask those questions. And I don't think that we are supposed to have all the answers. I don't think we ever will. You said that earlier. I believe that. I believe that there is an element of God that is mysterious, and that's the beauty of it. I believe that there's enough knowing in our experiences that we are reached in the way that God knows he can reach us with the brains that he gave us to have. And so for a long time, I had to apologize for the brain that I had, for the questions that I had, for the words that flew out of my mouth at warp speed. And I thought, well, I didn't make me like this. Like, whose fault is this really, right? Let's go back to the source. And so I think that there's a lot of grace that God extends, not only in who we are. He makes no apologies for that. I think and I say this is just me speaking my English language. I think we are bound by our human confines, right? We only have so much language. We only have so many experiences. We only have so many books to read, etc., and people with whom to share this with. I mean, whether it's the Hindu religion, I probably subscribe more to becoming closer to, if you're going to label it, like a universalist. I don't want to go down that path with people, but I do think that God is the only one to reconcile his people, right? Like, do I think that somebody who's 6 years old and has never heard the word, in your example, that's living in India, has never heard, doesn't know who Jesus is, and then all of a sudden, dies, that child, that 6-year-old little kid, because that kid hasn't heard the word of Jesus, that God's going to damn to the pits of hell? I do not think that, ever. How could we think that? And then also believe in a loving God. Those two things are very much in opposition to me, at least in my brain.
Well, and that's what this conversation's about. And it's so important because obviously the title, Faithful, Faithless, is meant to be a little provocative. We had a working title for this thing called In Good Faith, but then I looked it up and there are way too many In Good Faith podcasts. So I had to come up with something a little bit more unique. And also, when I started thinking about it, it was very true to what I think we are. Because right now, if I were to draw a continuum, where you've got pure, 100% faithful, and vice versa, faithless, we're probably closer to the middle, but definitely on one side of a arbitrary dividing line. But I think we share, and the reason I wanted to do this with you is because you were giving me an energy and an answer, and I'm not looking for concrete answers. I'm looking for the acceptance of, well, DP, that's a story in the Bible that was told that way so people who were pre-literate could understand the point you were trying to make. Like, Jesus told a lot of shepherd stories. Oh, wonder why. He was in a society of agrarians that were dealing with a lot of sheep and goats and other herd animals. And so he spoke to them in the language they understood. Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And even as a kid, that made sense. Even as a kid, where you mentioned earlier, God made us in his image as a kid. Yeah. I was thinking, well, right. That's funny because girls look different than boys. So which one is he? And maybe it's not about being a boy or a girl. Maybe it's about, and I didn't have the words at the time, but later on when I understood what DNA was, maybe God's DNA. Because every living thing on this planet has deoxyribonucleic acids that define it. And from that DNA, you can create an entire human being or an elephant or a lettuce or a cabbage. Maybe the image that we are created in is not a bipedal, two-armed, two-eared, two-eyed, two nostrils thing, but maybe it's something else altogether. And that led me to maybe all these things are not meant to be taken literally. Maybe they are in your words, and a lot of the books of the Bible are written in words of a society that no longer exists, and we're trying to interpret it based on a modern understanding.
That's right.
And it doesn't always work because, for instance, Leviticus, very interesting. A lot of those rules are just, hey guys, don't put plates in the same place. If they're meat plates, the meat plates go over here and the milk plates go over here. Why? Because we live in a desert and the flies that go over there are really bad. And we find that people get sick if you do that. So a lot of them are kind of like, this is basic desert dwelling nomadism 101.
Yeah, and but you're nailing it.
Yeah, but modern people are saying, aha, Leviticus says. Leviticus is like, yeah, well, Leviticus also has stuff about he who handles the pigskin. So football players, how does that work?
Yeah. Yeah.
So again, it's everything subject to interpretation, and that's what I think the key is. Allowing the human element, the human interpretive element, a place within to have that conversation. Some people don't, let's face it, some people don't want to have it. They'd rather have the rule book. How many times have you heard, well, if God gave us a rule book, an owner's manual on how to live a godly life, why wouldn't you follow it? And to my answer to that would be, because I haven't seen a copy of it. I've seen this other thing. It's full of poetry and history and prehistorian history that's been passed down. And by the way, a lot of it comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, and a lot of it seems to be influenced by Osiris, the god of the god of the dead of the Egyptians or whatever it was. And boy, a lot of those things that Jesus did, it feels like he was just trying to achieve parity with these other gods or deities that rose from the dead, who were able to heal the sick, who were able to walk on water. All these things, every single one of those things has precursors in other traditions and other religions.
Yeah. Yeah. All from the A&E, and that's ancient Near East. And that's so interesting to me is that, when people ask me that question too, or they'll say the rule book, I'm like, that's great. I'd like you to tell me the chapter where I can find the Nephilim so that when I leave the building where we're sitting in right now, I can just go encounter a Nephilim out back and just have a little conversation. And what's been difficult for me is I was mad at myself, if I'm honest. I was mad at myself for not making those correlations when I was younger. And then I became mad at other people for like, why didn't you teach me this stuff? And I thought, okay, well, being mad is like it's useless. It's baseless. And so what I have continued to try to do in the world is to show up and encourage people to keep asking those questions and to say, much like when you read any other book, you can throw yourself into a different time period, right? If the author is doing a good enough job of painting the picture of where the plot is occurring, right? Like what's the landscape like? What is the temperature like? What are the people like? What time period is this? And we, as astute human beings, can visualize that and understand that, well, when I put the book down, I'm going to walk outside and it's still going to be 2022. I'm not going to go out and see like Little House on the Prairie out back. That's not where I live right now. And so I don't understand why churches and people don't do a better job of saying, and when you read the book of Leviticus or when you read Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, it doesn't matter what book you read. You have to understand there was a writer and author of that book who was writing to a particular audience at that time. Same way with the Gospels in particular, right? I mean, Matthew, the Jews, the tax, like there was a method to their madness, if you will, a method to their authorship. They were saying, I'm trying to get a point across here. I'm trying to tell a story. And I know what my readers want to hear. So I know what I want to say. I know how it will resonate. And I'm going to write like that. If somebody would have said that to me back in the day, I would have been like, oh, now this book's interesting. Now I understand.
Well, exactly. I mean, contextually, when you understand the context, you go, oh,
Yeah.
oh, I get it. So what you're saying is that Joshua, they didn't blow trumpets and the walls came a-tumbling down. They played trumpets as part of a siege. The siege over time was able to overcome the walls. The author, after the fact, trying to impress how great we are compared to those guys, and God is always on our side, so we tell the story that way, and, you know, history is always written by the victors. Okay, great. What do I learn from that? And that's especially the I don't find the Bible valueless. I find it opaque a lot of times, but I think it's possible to search for the first principles. Like, what are you trying to say with that story? What is the truth of that story? Like, I find more inspired by Saul's ride to Damascus becoming Paul and the ability for he who is literally the tax collector, the government official, the absolute crappiest person on the world can literally become something else, transform to something else like that. That's the lesson. It's not the details. It's the lesson that type of transformation can happen if you, in your heart, want that transformation to happen. One of the things that I tell myself and my daughters every single day is you have the choice today to choose what type of person you want to be. Mm-hmm. If you want to steal some stuff from your employer, you can do it. If you can get away with it, no one will know and you'll feel smarter than everybody else. Or you'll feel like an absolute craphead who's violating your code that you've developed over time that's based on good versus evil. I mean, you've got to create your own code, I think. And some people want that code created for them. Okay, everyone's got to live by a code. But for me, it's more about finding that first principle idea. What is the first principle idea? Jesus throwing the money changers out of the temple. What is the idea? Get business out of the church. Stop talking. Don't swap business cards down during the potluck dinner in the basement. Be here, be now, be with your family, be with your friends, be with the church. Understand what we're here for, and don't use it as an opportunity to sell long-term life insurance.
Yeah, be respectful.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Anyway, so obviously we have a lot to talk about, and it's not going to be solved, or, we're not going to come to a complete agreement on any day, much less today, but the conversation has started. And that's what I'm really excited about, because for some reason I find Beth's voice compelling, and interesting. And, never thought about that. And I knew that when I was on your podcast, and I'm looking forward to having you on my podcast. What's the name of your podcast, by the way?
It's called the Remorseless Podcast. Remorseless means without guilt, in spite of wrongdoing. I learned guilt very well in the Catholic Church. So I'm here to tell people, you know what? We all have done wrong. Find me one person who's lived any amount of life who hasn't done wrong. But there's a way to show up and live without guilt. So it's called the Remorseless Podcast.
Well, check that out. I really had a good time on that. I also have a podcast too. It's about personal branding and marketing and blah, 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 blah. If you're at all interested in that, check out the Nonfiction Brand podcast, which Beth will be on. We're recording like next week or something, I think.
It is next week.
Yeah, and I'm looking forward to that because it's going to be very interesting. But we're not here to tell you what to think or how to think, but we are telling you to think, I guess. Join us in thinking through this and sharing, because one of the key things I wanted to be able to have this conversation or reveal is that, guess what? I am left of center politically. I don't go to church. I don't subscribe to a church or ascribe to, any of that stuff. I am not without God. I am not godless. I am not someone to be disrespected and ignored the same way that I do not ignore or disrespect those who are believers in whatever faith tradition you have. I am constantly thinking about a lyric from a Sting song. I hope the Russians love their children too. This was at the height of the Cold War. I hope the Russians love their children too. And when I first heard that lyric, I went, of course they love their children. Oh, of course they love their children. Oh, they're just like us. Oh, they aren't the great evil empire. They are just trying to survive the best way they can. Oh, maybe this is all about miscommunication, or, oh, they aren't evil. Oh, guess what? We all love our children. We all want what's best for them. I believe there's no shortage of prayer in the schools. As my dad used to say, every time there's a pop quiz, there's plenty of prayer in schools. But it's what I would call the type of prayer Jesus was talking about, that which happens between you and God in private, not forced on you by anybody, much less authority of whatever it is. Again, not here to talk about dogma, here to talk about what we can agree on. And I agree to the basic idea that Beth has some wonderful things to share about faithfulness. I hope she can help me discover new things on my road toward Damascus.
Which is interesting because, when my husband is, what's the right word? I don't know, being annoying, we're having discussions on a more continual basis. I say to him, honey, I need you to get out of Damascus. Please no longer be a Damascus. So yes, I will help you on your road to avoiding Damascus.
Beth, if people wanted to follow you and what you're doing a little bit more closely, where could they go or how could they engage with you?
Yeah, thank you. Just my website, bethfisher.com, and you will find resources out there. You'll find former podcasts and shows and my books, my workbook, speaking engagements. That's the best place to connect with me.
And you can guess where I am. I'm DP Knudten at dpknudten.com, spelled that way, because my parents decided to make my life a little bit more difficult than most. Yeah, but that's the roll of the dice you get when you join humanity on this earth. Beth, I want to thank you so much for joining me in this conversation. I hope to have these on a regular basis. We don't know, frankly, what that regular basis is going to be because we're just finding this out ourselves. So when we stop this live stream, I think we're probably going to have a quick conversation and say, well, what did you think? How often should we do this? I don't know. Should we turn this into a podcast? I don't know. How do we get this done? I don't know. We'll figure all that stuff out. All I know is that this is a conversation I would like to have, and I can't speak for you, but you did mention that you would like to have this conversation too. So I'm going to go with that.
Yeah, you can speak for me. Yes. In this capacity only, yes, I'm in. Sign me up.
All right. Well, that's it for this edition of Faithless, a conversation in good faith with Beth Fisher. I think, she's on that side, I think, and DP Knudten. And we'll be talking to you again next time. Bye-bye.